3 countries, 3 wins, 1 wall. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he came back with a specific list of problems he wanted solved. China had quietly planted itself across Latin America. Venezuela had collapsed into a narco state, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. Cuba was still running the same revolutionary playbook from 1959, and Iran was getting closer to a nuclear weapon every single month. In the Western Hemisphere, Trump moved fast and produced results that no American president had managed in a generation. Panama, Venezuela, Cuba, real movement, real strategic gains. Then came Iran. Same president, same instincts, same pressure tactics, completely different result. This is not a political defense of Trump or an attack on him. It is an honest look at what actually happened, why the hemisphere strategy worked, why Iran is a fundamentally different problem, and what the clock ticking toward November 2026 means for everything. What Trump inherited and why it mattered. To understand what Trump did in his second term, you have to understand the map he inherited. China spent roughly 2 decades embedding itself into Latin America while Washington looked the other way. The numbers tell the story plainly. Between 2005 and 2020, China lent over $130 billion to Latin American and Caribbean countries, according to the Inter-American Dialogue's China-Latin America Finance Database. That money came with strings, infrastructure contracts, port operating rights, military cooperation agreements, political loyalty.
Once seen as the United States' backyard, is beginning to switch sides. In 2000, China barely had a footprint in the region. Today, it's South America's largest trading partner. In Brazil, trade has already ballooned to over $180 billion, more than twice what it does with the US. And the effects are already showing. Not long ago, China bought most of its soybeans from American farmers. Now, its main supplier is Brazil, a shift that was never accidental, but part of a much bigger plan.
The Panama Canal was the sharpest example. The canal itself is operated by the Panama Canal Authority, a Panamanian government body, but the port facilities at both ends of the waterway, Balboa on the Pacific side and Cristobal on the Atlantic side, were operated under concession by Hutchison Ports, a subsidiary of the Hong Kong conglomerate CK Hutchison Holdings. American military planners had flagged the strategic concern for years. A Chinese-affiliated company controlling port access at both ends of the most important waterway in the Western Hemisphere was not a neutral arrangement. Venezuela was a different kind of problem. Nicolás Maduro had not won a legitimate election since taking power after Hugo Chavez died in 2013. The Carter Center, which had previously certified Venezuelan elections, refused to validate the 2018 and 2024 presidential results. By 2024, the United Nations reported that roughly 7.7 million Venezuelans had left the country, one of the largest displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere in modern history. The Maduro regime was simultaneously running narco-trafficking operations, accepting Chinese investment in its oil infrastructure, receiving Russian diplomatic protection at the UN Security Council, and sitting on 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest proven reserves on Earth, according to OPEC data. Cuba was the longer-running problem. The Castro revolutionary government had survived for over 6 decades through a series of external lifelines, Soviet subsidies until 1991, then Venezuelan oil subsidies under Hugo Chavez, starting in the early 2000s, Chinese investment and trade, remittances from Cubans living abroad. Without outside support, the Cuban economy, which produces almost nothing of significant export value, cannot sustain itself. But the regime had survived long enough to eliminate any internal political competition capable of replacing it. Trump looked at all 3 of these situations and concluded they shared a common feature: Chinese and Russian presence in America's immediate neighborhood, propping up governments that served neither American interests nor the interests of their own people, had been allowed to grow for years because Washington kept treating it as someone else's problem. He decided it was his problem, and he moved to fix it. What happened next in the hemisphere produced results that most foreign policy analysts, even skeptical ones, acknowledged as significant strategic gains. Panama and the port deal. The Panama Canal situation had a cleaner solution than most foreign policy problems get. Trump applied pressure publicly and loudly, raising the possibility of American reassertion of influence over the canal and making clear that Chinese-affiliated control of port facilities was unacceptable. The Panamanian government, which genuinely needs its relationship with the United States to function economically, responded.
Donald Trump wants the Panama Canal back.
We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
He's accused Panama of ripping off America.
The American ships are being severely overcharged.
Claimed it's run by Chinese soldiers.
It's being operated by China.
And suggested he could try to take it by force. But the canal has operated smoothly ever since Panama took full control of it over 25 years ago. So why is Trump so fixated on it now? The 51-mile-long Panama Canal links the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Central America. By bypassing the long and dangerous route around the southern tip of South America, it saves freight ships thousands of miles and weeks of travel time. It is central to the world economy. Around 5% of global maritime trade uses the canal every year, and America is its biggest customer. 40% of its container traffic passes through it annually. The canal was built by America between 1904 and 1914, but in 1977, President Jimmy Carter agreed to transfer control to Panama by 1999.
President of Panama, I love that canal. Jose, I think he made the greatest deal in history. He bought it for $1. One of our brilliant presidents. I can't sleep over that deal. They gave it to him for $1.
In March 2025, CK Hutchison Holdings announced an agreement to sell its port operations in Panama, along with 43 other ports in 23 countries, to a consortium led by BlackRock, the American investment firm, and its partners. The deal, valued at approximately $22.8 billion, was reported by the Financial Times and confirmed by multiple financial news outlets. The sale would transfer operational control of the Balboa and Cristobal ports away from the Chinese conglomerate. The Chinese government pushed back. Chinese state media criticized the deal. Beijing's Commerce Ministry launched a review. As of the time of writing, the full completion of the transaction remained subject to regulatory approvals, and it faced complications from Chinese government pressure on CK Hutchison. But the strategic direction was unmistakable. A Chinese-affiliated entity controlling both ends of the Panama Canal was no longer the baseline assumption. American pressure had moved the situation. No American soldiers were deployed. No shots were fired. Economic pressure, diplomatic signaling, and the Panamanian government's rational calculation about where its long-term interests sit produced measurable movement on a problem that previous administrations had largely ignored. The Venezuela situation would require significantly more force and produce significantly more dramatic results. Venezuela and the fall of Maduro. Venezuela is the largest strategic achievement of Trump's second-term foreign policy, and it deserves to be called that directly. The Maduro regime fell. The specific sequence of events involved a combination of sharply tightened American sanctions, coordinated diplomatic pressure across the region, and what multiple American and Latin American officials described as targeted pressure on the Venezuelan military's senior leadership. The Venezuelan military, which had kept Maduro in power through multiple crises, ultimately withdrew its support. Trump had reimposed maximum pressure sanctions on Venezuela in February 2025, reversing Biden administration oil license agreements that had allowed some Venezuelan oil exports to resume. The sanctions targeted not only the Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA, but individuals in the military and security services with specifically identified assets and travel restrictions. By mid-2025, Maduro's government had collapsed. A transitional framework emerged that included American corporate involvement in Venezuelan oil production, conditioned on a credible path toward free elections. Chevron, which had maintained limited operations in Venezuela under Biden-era licenses, expanded its role. The arrangement tied the full return of Venezuelan economic sovereignty to democratic transition benchmarks. The outcome matters strategically for reasons beyond Venezuela itself. Venezuela under Maduro had been the primary source of subsidized oil keeping the Cuban regime alive. Chavez-era agreements had provided Cuba with roughly 100,000 barrels of oil per day at preferential rates, according according to reporting from the Council on Foreign Relations. With Maduro gone and Venezuelan oil now operating under an American-supervised framework, that subsidy pipeline was severed. Cuba's external lifeline was cut in ways that no amount of American sanctions applied directly to Havana had previously managed to achieve. The same deal-making logic that worked in Panama worked here, applied with more force. Identify the leverage, target the people making the decisions, give them a personal exit that does not require them to die for Maduro. The Venezuelan military's loyalty was transactional. When the transaction became unprofitable, the loyalty ended. That logic works when the people making the decisions have material interests that can be targeted and adjusted. The reason Iran is a completely different story begins precisely there. Cuba and the slow squeeze. Cuba is the slower play, and it is measurably advancing. The Trump administration redesignated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism in January 2025, a status the Biden administration had removed. It tightened restrictions on remittances, which had been a significant source of hard currency for both Cuban families and, indirectly, the Cuban state. It expanded sanctions on Cuban military enterprises, which control large portions of the Cuban economy, through a network of companies overseen by the armed forces business conglomerate known as GISA. The combination of the Venezuela collapse and the tightened American sanctions placed the Cuban regime under greater economic pressure than it had faced since the early 1990s, the period Cubans call the Special Period, when the Soviet collapse eliminated subsidies and triggered widespread shortages. Cuba's GDP contracted by an estimated 2% in 2023, according to Cuba's own official statistics, which analysts generally consider to understate the actual deterioration. The Cuban government responded to the economic pressure the way authoritarian governments typically respond, by restricting movement, increasing repression of dissent, and blaming external enemies for internal failures. That response buys time, but does not solve the underlying economic problem. The island's power grid, already severely strained, experienced nationwide blackouts through 2024 and into 2025, with the government unable to provide reliable electricity for more than a few hours daily in many areas, according to reporting from Reuters and the Associated Press. Cuba is not resolved. The regime retains control of its security apparatus and has not shown any sign of negotiating a transition. But the material conditions sustaining it have deteriorated significantly, and the external lifelines have been cut in ways that make the long-term trajectory harder to sustain. Whether that deterioration reaches a breaking point before the 2026 midterms is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that the hemisphere strategy has worked better than most foreign policy observers predicted, and the reason it worked reveals exactly why Iran is a fundamentally different problem. Why the hemisphere strategy worked. The deal-making framework Trump applied across the hemisphere rests on a specific assumption. It assumes the other party has concrete interests that can be identified, pressured, and ultimately negotiated. Money, personal security, institutional survival. It assumes the counterparty can recognize when the cost of continued resistance exceeds the benefit of making a deal. Panama's government manages a canal that generates approximately $4.6 billion annually in revenue, according to the Panama Canal Authority's 2023 annual report. That revenue depends on international trade relationships. The Panamanian government had an obvious material interest in maintaining its relationship with the United States. Rational actors responded rationally. Venezuela's military leadership had personal bank accounts, families, and futures. When the sanctions made those futures look increasingly bleak and a negotiated exit was available, the calculation changed. Corrupt institutions respond to material pressure because they are, by definition, organized around material interest. Cuba's regime is more ideologically committed than Venezuela's military, but it still runs on material reality. Oil, hard currency, trade. Cutting those inputs does not guarantee collapse, but it makes survival progressively harder. The common thread across all three is that the governments or institutions making the decisions have interests that exist outside their ideology. Personal wealth, institutional survival, economic inputs. Apply enough pressure on those interests and you change the calculation. Iran's theocratic leadership has constructed its entire political legitimacy around the argument that material pressure from America is irrelevant compared to divine mission. That is not simply rhetoric. It is the constitutional foundation of the Iranian state, and understanding it is the difference between comprehending Iran and consistently being surprised by it. What Iran actually is. The Islamic Republic of Iran was not simply a political revolution in 1979. It was a theological one. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini built the Iranian state on the concept of velayat-e-faqih, which translates roughly as the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The idea is that political authority legitimately belongs to the most qualified Islamic scholar until the return of the hidden imam, a messianic figure in Shia Islam. This is not symbolic language. It is the constitutional framework of the Iranian government, codified in the 1979 Constitution and reaffirmed in the 1989 revision. The supreme leader, currently Ali Khamenei, who has held the position since Khomeini's death in 1989, derives his authority from this theological framework. His legitimacy is not electoral. It is not based on economic performance. It is based on his position as the jurisprudential guardian of an Islamic state that defines itself in opposition to Western imperialism as a matter of religious principle. The phrase "death to America," which appears at Iranian state functions, Friday prayers, and official government communications, is not campaign rhetoric. It is a liturgical expression of the state's foundational identity. American researchers at the University of Maryland's Program on International Policy Attitudes have documented that Iranian leaders use this framing not as hyperbole, but as a statement of theological and political commitment to resistance. The history of Iranian decision-making under pressure confirms this. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, Iran suffered an estimated 200,000 to 600,000 military deaths according to various historical assessments, along with enormous civilian casualties and economic devastation, and continued fighting for years after the original Iraqi aggression had been repelled. Khomeini pursued the war into Iraqi territory because he believed defeating Saddam Hussein would spread the Islamic Revolution. When the war finally ended in a ceasefire, Khomeini publicly described accepting it as drinking poison. He chose poison over what he perceived as compromise with an enemy of the revolution. Every Iranian leader who has shown genuine flexibility toward the United States has faced severe domestic consequences. Mohammad Khatami pursued dialogue in the late 1990s and was systematically undermined by hardline institutions. Hassan Rouhani negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal and watched it destroyed, first by Trump's 2018 withdrawal and then by the Iranian hardline backlash domestically. The lesson Iranian decision-makers have drawn from these cases is consistent. Accommodation of America destroys political careers and institutional positions within the Islamic Republic. Resistance, regardless of the material cost, maintains legitimacy. This is not an adversary with a price. It is an adversary whose identity is the resistance itself, what the military campaign achieved and what it did not. American military action against Iran in 2025 produced significant tactical results that fall well short of strategic resolution. American strikes killed over 60 senior Iranian military and political figures, including Revolutionary Guard commanders and figures connected to Iran's nuclear program, according to reporting from Reuters, the Associated Press, and the New York Times. The Iranian Navy's surface capabilities in the Persian Gulf were substantially degraded. American forces established effective operational control of the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration.
A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Its menacing activities directly endanger the United States, our troops, our bases overseas, and our allies throughout the world. For 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted "Death to America" and waged an unending campaign of bloodshed and mass murder, targeting the United States, our troops, and the innocent people in many, many countries. Among the regime's very first acts was to back a violent takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding dozens of American hostages for 444 days. With Operation Epic Fury! Is that a great name? Well, it's only good if you win. You know, you can only do. And we've won. Let me say, we've won. You know, you never like to say too early you won. We won. We won the bet. In the first hour, it was over. We won. But they gave me a list of names in general. Sir, you can pick the name you'd like, sir. I said, the name of what? The name of the attack on Iran, sir. And they gave me like 20 names. And I'm like falling asleep. I didn't like any of them. Then I see Epic Fury. I said, I like that name. I like that name.
These are genuine military achievements. The strikes demonstrated American capability and imposed real costs on Iranian military institutions. The problem is structural. Iran's ability to project regional power does not rest primarily on its conventional navy or its senior generals. It rests on a proxy network built over 4 decades specifically because direct military confrontation with American forces is not survivable. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with an arsenal the Council on Foreign Relations estimates at over 150,000 rockets and missiles. The Houthis in Yemen, who demonstrated the ability to strike commercial shipping across the Red Sea through 2023 and 2024. Shia militia networks across Iraq and Syria. These proxy forces are dispersed, low signature, and not meaningfully degraded by strikes on Iranian naval vessels or the deaths of IRGC generals. Iran's nuclear infrastructure, the hardened underground facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, was damaged but not destroyed. Independent nuclear analysts at the Arms Control Association and the Federation of American Scientists assessed that the strikes set the program back but did not eliminate it. The underground depth of Fordo, buried under roughly 80 meters of rock, means that destroying it with conventional munitions requires specific ordnance and direct hits that are extremely difficult to confirm. And the Iranian leadership's response to the military campaign was not capitulation. It was a reaffirmation of resistance, delivered through state media and Friday prayers, framed as confirmation that American aggression proved the revolution's warnings correct. The gap between what the military campaign achieved tactically and what it would need to achieve to produce the strategic outcome Trump needs is where the Iran problem lives. The clock and what comes next. November 2026 is only months away. The midterm elections will determine whether Republicans maintain control of the House and Senate. The historical pattern for second-term presidents in midterms is consistently negative. The party controlling the White House has lost House seats in every midterm election since 1994, with one exception. Trump's House majority is narrow enough that a modest swing ends it. The Iran situation creates specific political exposure that the hemisphere winds cannot fully offset. The Strait of Hormuz. American operational control of the strait is a military achievement that also creates an ongoing American responsibility in one of the world's most commercially sensitive waterways. Persian Gulf oil disruption produces oil price increases that reach American consumers at the gas pump. If the Iran standoff produces sustained energy price increases heading into 2026, that economic pain lands directly on the voters deciding the midterms. A foreign policy success that costs $5 gasoline is not a net political win. The escalation question has no clean resolution. The space between full-scale war and a negotiated settlement sits in an uncomfortable middle zone that requires constant management. Maintaining that zone for 18 months without a catastrophic incident or a political collapse of the strategy demands a kind of sustained operational discipline that is genuinely difficult. The options Trump faces are essentially 3. First, escalate to the level required to fundamentally destroy the Iranian nuclear program and degrade the regime's military capacity to the point of collapse. That level of action carries unpredictable regional consequences, significant oil market disruption, and the genuine possibility of Iranian proxy retaliation across the Middle East that expands beyond anyone's control. Second, find a framework, something that constrains the Iranian nuclear program verifiably without requiring the Iranian government to publicly surrender. This is what the 2015 nuclear deal attempted. Reconstructing something similar after the military strikes and targeted killings is significantly harder politically for both sides, but it may be the only exit that does not lead somewhere much worse. Third, manage the stalemate. Accept that Iran is a contained problem rather than a solved one. Maintain enough military pressure to prevent nuclear breakout and redirect political energy toward the hemisphere winds and the domestic economic agenda. The dealmaker met the martyr, and the clock does not stop while Washington figures out what happens next. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, the next one goes deeper still. Subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the only way to catch it when it drops.